Well, welcome to the architecture debate. And I knew at an information governance conference that there was going to be a very small subset that would be interested in this topic, but we're very glad that you're here. We think that this is actually going to be a debate that's a lot more fun to watch than maybe any you might have seen on TV lately. I don't know about you. I've not been able to watch television for several weeks. I turned that off. So I think today's discussion is going to be much more, fun for the geek in all of us. We're going to talk a bit about architecture. We've chosen sides here, so we have service-oriented architecture, or SOA. I don't really like the term SOA, but people call it that too.
So what?
So what? Yeah.
So what?
I got you. So, SOA. Now,
Hey,
and microservices architecture, and we're going to be talking a bit about that and what we even mean by that, why it matters. And so, on the microservices side, we've got Andrea Chiappe, and she's going to be representing that. Yes, welcome her. And also for the SOA, and mainly because we needed someone to oppose microservices, even though Rob and I, well, we'll talk about that toward the end of the debate, where we fall on that stuff. But we're going to have Rob go ahead, Rob Bogue.
Hi.
Hello. Represent the service-oriented architecture side. We gave him the hardest job, I think, for this. So let's start with, there are our names. And I'm Kevin Parker. I'm the moderator for today's debate. And thankful that I'm not actually answering all the questions today. So let's talk about first, Rob, what is service-oriented architecture for our audience?
I have no idea.
You have?
I have no idea.
Can we get someone else? No, kidding.
No, it's a way of trying to take your legacy applications and expose them in a way that is consumable, right? And it's kind of a historic thing, something that we've had for a while that uses technologies like SOAP to encapsulate things. And hopefully you've got a EAI or an enterprise application integration platform to put those together. And I don't know why I can't talk today, but there you go. There's SOA.
So tell us just very briefly, what's the point? Like, where did SOA come from? Why? What's the driver for a service-oriented architecture approach compared to what was before it?
Well, so there's first the earth cooled, then the dinosaurs came, then we had punch cards, and then we had big massive systems that had no interfaces whatsoever, right? And so SOA came out of, hey, now we've got lots of big systems that don't know how to talk to each other, so we're going to build up interfaces that we can hopefully stitch together these very large monolithic COBOL things that we hoped would fall over in 2000 but didn't. So that's kind of...
Okay, so it's about integration. It's about getting systems to talk to each other.
Yep.
Okay. All right, Andrea, let's talk about microservices.
Cool. Am I allowed to walk around, or you're going to keep the Italian girl sitting down? I talk very much with my hands. So.
I'm not going to stop you, so
okay.
if you'd like to stand up, that's fine.
Okay, cool.
I heard earlier that they wouldn't let you dance, though. So.
No dance. Well, I was actually going to give a choreography comparison between
interpretive dance for this?
Exactly,
yeah, okay.
Of what a microservice versus services-oriented architecture is. So when I look at microservices, purists of SOA are going to say, there's no difference. It's just done right. It's just microservices just are SOA done right. And while there are tendencies that would be accurate, there are a lot of differences underneath of the covers if you just start scratching a little bit different. So microservices term is around fine, some people will refer to it as fine-grained SOA, or taking it another level, it's single function design of that services-oriented architecture. So they are extensions. There are some similarities between the two, but they're definitely not the same. And as we dig in today, we're going to talk about some of the areas that we have to be concerned from a governance perspective as well. So I think that's probably the next part of this. I'll wait to go there.
Okay. Yeah. So I have on the screen, which don't be afraid if you can't read it. It's not really that interesting.
It's the obligatory block diagram. We had to have one. So you
had to have an acronym. It's exactly the obligatory design presentation here. This diagram is about, it's an architecture approach from a framework called the Mike 2 framework. If you haven't seen that before, you can Google Mike 2.0 and you'll find it. It is one way of looking at architecture. SAFE stands for Strategic Architecture for a Federated Enterprise. This is a free thing that you can get. I threw that up there because I actually had one that was even simpler than this, but I thought maybe this will give us something to talk about. So when we're looking at this, we've got a couple of different layers. We've got like your infrastructure. You've got things like your enabling technologies, your enterprise business process management, content management, and things. But then other enterprise applications on top of that, composite applications, business intelligence, and then right at the top we've got this presentation layer. So this is kind of, when we talk about architecture, you've got to have the diagrams, right? So is this an example of a service-oriented architecture or microservices? Neither, both? Where would you go, Andrea?
So on this particular diagram, there isn't necessarily enough detail and I think by design probably, that's probably why you selected it, to be able to lend us one way or another. If I scratch down a service layer or down a little bit deeper into that application tier, on services-oriented architecture, what I'm going to start seeing are some, let me go back to microservice and compare and contrast, is the taxonomy differences of that service itself. I have a functional service and I have infrastructure service. And those are the two types of services that exist in microservices. It makes them very capable of doing very specific tasks. When I look at it from a services-oriented architecture, if I dug down into what that application tier looks like, I get more tiers of what those services are. I'm going to get into business services, enterprise services, messaging services, application and infrastructure, and then whatever you want to build on top. So I have a lot more services that come together in order to do two things. You know, and so for me, it's not one or the other. It's going to be where we dig in on that application tier.
Okay. Rob, want to take a stab at that?
I think I'd agree, which I know is really not really good form for
You must
debate.
disagree.
I must disagree.
No, you don't.
But I think, I think whether it's SOA, whether it's microservices, there's, how are you going to use it, right? And for me, John just was talking about design thinking and idea, and he was talking about a lot of really cool things, which are great concepts, but they become practical and pragmatic. I mean, I think when I go to build any architecture, whether it's SOA, microservices, whether I'm using SOAP or JSON or whatever I'm doing, I'm always building to, and how is someone going to use it? What is it I'm building for? I get to sit down with the CIO in a state very near to home 10 years ago probably, and he had a big SOA project going on because they had lots and lots of legacy code. And I, at the time, and you can boo if you need to, was doing a SharePoint project. And, okay, thank you. And I was doing the SharePoint project, and he came to me and he says, Rob, you finally made my SOA make sense. I'm like, you've been working on a project for 18 months. What are you telling me? I, as a SharePoint consultant at the time, made this make sense. He's like, you know what, until I can surface this somewhere, until I can have consumers, until I can make this usable, it doesn't matter. And so for this model, I would say the part that's really important are those blue boxes, right? How is this infrastructure that we're talking about going to get consumed?
Okay, so would it be fair to say then that what you choose or how you do architecture has something to do with the problem you're trying to solve?
I would hope so.
Okay, so should it? So what else would dictate which type of approach you would use for service-oriented architecture versus microservices?
Right. So for me as a tech head, I grew up in services-oriented as well, and making the transition over to microservices, there are some key differences in there that, and I agree 100% that it needs to make sense, but some of the ways that we can look at, does it make sense? On microservices, we look at it more from a choreography type of deal where each service would call its own service. It's not allowed to hit the database. So there's an individual database per service by design. On SOA, it's more of an orchestration. Imagine a conductor in an orchestra. It's one guy. He's the middleware, and he's saying, now you play, and you play, and you play. If I'm looking at it from a dance perspective, to come back over there, it's more we're all deciding to sync together and play together. And so what that brings a business, why businesses are so interested, is the agility, the ability to really get on pace with rapid deployments. I mean, from an InfoGov perspective, if I were to say, hey, releases nightly, releases 10 times a day, that's a scary proposition if you don't know how to govern that. And I think that's the important piece when we look at microservices and services-oriented architecture. One is lending towards bigger enterprise type of applications and problems. The other one is looking at more, algorithmic, cool economy type of things that we're moving towards, but can definitely take advantage of applications as today. So,
Is there an instance or maybe a type of scenario where it really makes more sense to do service-oriented architecture? In the traditional sense of it's the orchestration of many different parts, and usually it's after the fact that you already have silos that you're trying to bring together. Rarely have I seen personally, it's let's start with an SOA and then let's build out from there. It's more of the enterprise application integration stuff.
Right.
Is there, when would you choose that traditional approach, or would you still today? Like what kind of scenario? Give me an example.
Well, so if we're talking greenfield, right? Like, so greenfield versus brownfield. Brownfield, it's already been built. We're trying to figure out what to do with it. Greenfield, we get to start from scratch. When we look at the outputs, when we look at what it's going to get consumed by, you might have a set of services that you want to expose that you have an existing SOA implementation, enterprise architecture, all that stuff that knows how to talk SOAP and it knows how to do those things, and that's what it knows. And so I said, well, it's greenfield, but you still have other things in your organization. You might choose an architecture that has the methodological, the architectural point of view of microservices, but you might expose it from a technological point of view, not just from REST and JSON, which would be more typical for microservices, but also through web services and SOAP, like you would expect out of SOA. So the scenario I would have for you is 80% of what we're going to do is web and mobile, but we have 20% that we've got to go be able to integrate into existing backend systems. If I were talking click and mortar, if I wanted to integrate an online experience and a mobile experience with an existing on-prem, I would do a model that probably looks a lot architecturally like microservices, but might surface the same kinds of interfaces you'd expect out of SOA.
yeah, and just to expand on that, there on the microservices side, it's REST. On the SOA side, it's like a heterogeneous interoperability. It can understand REST, JSON, SOAP, Java, whatever you're bringing to the picture. I think it's that interoperability makes it a differentiator. By no means does microservices proclaim that that's what they're after. They're after rapid, secure. That's something that we really haven't taken a moment to think about. By dividing out that database layer from each service, now I can say that this one's on the customer side and I don't have to worry about compliance on these because it's just the agility, the user interface, what's happening over here from a innovation standpoint. So my developers become very innovative. On this side, and I can bring in my security into very specific services. They're hitting the database. I'm hardening those areas, and that's why you'll hear that microservices are just hardened SOA implementations. So, there's a lot of areas that you would still use traditional, and they're both beautiful architectures. It's just one is, yeah.
So I've heard you guys mention the term REST a couple of times. Is that what we're going to be doing after the party tonight, or what, can you define
That's
REST
the
for us?
afternoon nap.
Well, there's that too. Hopefully not at the moment. Yes.
It's the communication, right? It's how we're communicating when you call something. So microservices is definitely more API based, and it's being able to call via an HTTP request and getting back a set result. So it's a rapid way to integrate, a rapid way from a developer's perspective to get those things moving. There's some areas that, on the microservices side that gets scary, I would imagine, from an information governance perspective. When you have rapid deployments, how are you handling that from change control is the next, that's the next question of how you would go about that. And there are, it's scary at first, but it's actually doable.
So representational state transfer, it's URL encoding to make the request to the web service.
Okay, so as I'm sitting here or standing here moderating, I'm thinking with my government consulting hat on, I keep hearing all these acronyms, and the things that I do from my day-to-day work with clients, I have to define every single acronym. So we've mentioned what REST is. You've mentioned HTTP. That's web calls. Let's just call it that.
Oh, we don't have to define that one?
Let's
Hypertext transport.
yes. There were a couple of others that we just threw out. I just want to make sure that we're hitting
JSON.
all these terms. JSON, JavaScript object notation,
Yeah.
right?
Java.
There's all these different types of technologies that we're discussing up here, but they all can be architected in ways that will make your enterprise applications work, really is what we're getting at. That's what I'm hearing. So a lot of agreement. Can you get too strict on microservices or SOA within an enterprise, and can that impede you?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. And I've seen that in different bases that I've, customer bases that I've gone to. You can get so broad in how you handle SOA that it almost becomes a monolith. You can get so granular within microservices and how you decide to divide each service that it becomes a performance hindrance. So your performance degrades because you've now said, okay, so customer logs in, now customer does this, now customer does this, and you've divided them out, normalized. So on the database side, if anybody knows what over-normalized databases, it's almost over-normalized services. So there is an art to that, I think, in the way that we design architecture.
I concur.
All right, good enough.
I'm a lousy debater. I agree too much.
All right, so we've got these different architectural approaches. What would drive your decisions in choosing one or a hybrid? Let's start with Rob on this one.
So why would I choose one versus the other? For me, I'd try
or a mix.
Or a mix, yeah. I mean, I think we kind of did a little bit of this earlier, right? Like if you have an existing infrastructure that you're plugging into, that leads you to continuing that pattern. Maybe not always, but a substantial portion of the time, introducing new patterns is not always the best. I think you have to look at your clients and how you're going to consume it. If you're designing services, microservices to be consumed by web, that's not going to be SOA, because SOA historically has been SOAP web services, and they're not easy to call from JavaScript. So I think it's a lot about how do you bridge from the past to the future, and how do you find a solution that works. And I like the idea that you implement the actual APIs, the actual calls that you're doing in a meaningful way, and then you surface the interfaces to it. One's REST, and one's SOAP, and one's something different.
All right, well, so we have 1 minute left. Let's talk about the implications of information governance.
Right. So I think the important thing here is when we talk about the migration from SOA over to microservices, you see companies like Netflix who have done that very successfully. And what that meant that they did is they looked at their organizations as, are there any Star Trek fans? All right, so the Bogue, right? So if I look at the Bogue and I'm saying, okay, now here's this group who are doing this one thing over here, but they're working very tightly together. They're almost like a business in themselves. So your businesses almost become, by way of the architecture you're choosing, tiny businesses within it. So that means that I'm the developer, the QA person, the support person, whoever it is amongst my little Bogue team that is actually implementing this microservice, and I'm releasing it whenever I want to, independently of everybody else. Whereas in SOA, I'm releasing it on a quarterly basis versus a nightly basis. I have very set testing strategies. So that is a disruption to our businesses and how we look at governing those. What are your challenges going to be on the governance side when you look at these micro teams starting to work at that agile level? And you're going to have to change some of that governance from your change management perspective, and then also release management perspective and an information governance side. So it becomes very rapid fire and something that's historically not been, I think.
All right. Good. That is our time. Please thank our debaters. We're going to be in the Q&A room for a little bit if you want to follow us into there, and I'm going to turn it over now to the next session.